We're leaving the realm of typical Why This Universe topics today to hear the perspective of someone who normally goes under the radar in the world of science. The voice behind some of your favorite articles on big journalist platforms like the New York Times. Who are these people that bring science to the widest public audience available, really? So today we're going to hear from a science journalist, and we get into an interesting conversation about what doing this kind of job is like, some of the challenges and quirks. But first, a little announcement from us at Why This Universe. We're going to be partnering with professors.fm starting soon, and they're a platform that helps support shows like ours with leading academic voices. So you might be hearing more about that soon. As always, if you want to access ad-free episodes or other exclusive content like Ask Us Anything questions, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $3 a month. It helps support our show, and you get to have more direct access to Dan and I and ask questions, and we're building a nice little community there. So to check that out, you can always go to patreon.com/whythisuniverse. If you enjoy the kind of conversations we have here on Why This Universe, then there's another University of Chicago podcast network show that you should check out. It's called The Pie. Join host Tess Vigland as she talks with leading economists about their cutting-edge research and key events of the day. Hear how the economic pie is at the heart of issues like the aftermath of a global pandemic, jobs, energy policy, and much more. You're listening to Why This Universe, a podcast where we break down the biggest ideas in physics. I'm Shalma Wegsman.
And I'm Dan Hooper. Our guest on this episode of Why This Universe is Katrina Miller. I first met Katrina while she was a grad student at the University of Chicago. There she studied neutrinos as a member of the collaboration that conducted the microboon experiment. After earning her PhD in experimental particle physics earlier this year, she moved away from research and into science journalism, becoming a reporting fellow on the science desk of the New York Times. In addition to her work at the New York Times, she's written for Wired, Scientific American, Physics Today, and other places. And she's also a co-founder of the I Am Project, which is an organization that aims to empower women of color in STEM. Welcome, Katrina, to Why This Universe.
Thank you. You make me sound so impressive.
It's easy to do. It's easy to do. So we want to talk today kind of about science journalism, and maybe let's just start with a super broad, open-ended question. Tell us how I should think of science journalism. How is it different from other kinds of journalism? What kind of skills and what kind of people does it take to fulfill this particular role at a place like the New York Times?
Oh, that's very multifaceted. I don't think that's basic at all. So there's sort of two groups, right? There are people who come from science and there are people who come from like a journalism background. And people who come from a journalism background, I think, have a lot more formal training and, reporting skills and things like that. But then obviously there's a benefit of coming from a scientific background in that, you have an understanding of how science functions. You have an understanding of how to parse scientific concepts. And so a lot of people coming from the science background will want to come into science communication, which I think is a huge umbrella catch-all term. And science journalism is just one aspect of that, right? So there's a lot of different ways you can do science communication. You can do podcasts like this. You can hop on YouTube or TikTok and start sharing your scientific expertise. But a science journalist, rather than them being the expert, they are interviewing experts and then relaying that information to the general public. So nowhere is your opinion really supposed to come into play. You're just literally reporting what the experts are telling you. Good.
So the compared to other kinds of science communication, you're supposed to be kind of a neutral arbiter as a science journalist. So that's the distinction.
Could I ask if that's ever a challenge for you? Do you ever feel like you're holding back some level of emotion or excitement or something?
I think objectivity is a pillar that is generally strived for in journalism. And I think that very much mirrors the objectivity that is strived for in science, like doing your work, analyzing your data free from bias. And so obviously in the same way that scientists can often get excited or skeptical or have opinions about their work, but try to put those opinions on a shelf when they're looking at the data, journalists do that too, right? So I actually feel like I was pretty well trained in that regard, coming through a science program and then transitioning to journalism. Personally, I think it's impossible to, like, anytime you have a human endeavor, you're going to have some subjectivity in it, right? But there are ways that we can blind ourselves, if you will, to use the scientific term, to achieve the most objective result possible.
Have any of the writing you've done been criticized for not being, by somebody's perception, adequately neutral or unbiased?
Not yet, thankfully. Actually, I have had some readers write to me with a misunderstanding that because I was reporting on a certain subject or reporting a viewpoint on a certain subject, it must mean that I share that viewpoint, when in fact that maybe I necessarily don't, right? So a very recent example is for Nobel Week, I wrote a story based on a study done by a scientist at, I want to say Stanford, but maybe check that, who had analyzed the scientific productivity of people who had received Nobel Prizes, right? And was basically making the claim that, well, their citations and their publications are going down. So that must mean that winning a Nobel Prize means that you're less impactful on your field. And I personally, I don't share that view. I think that everyone in science knows that it's very difficult to boil down productivity into metrics like citation counts, H-index, publication patterns and things like that. But I have had some people conflate the fact that I was reporting on something with like, this must be her opinion. Why are you reporting on this? So it happens.
So with some of your articles where you're covering something that's like legitimately controversial, there must be people who aren't happy no matter what you do, right? So I was just kind of perusing over some of your recent work in preparation for this conversation, and I found this article you wrote for the Times in July. The title is "Scientist Deep Dive for Alien Life Leaves His Peers Dubious," and so about Avi Loeb, and
right.
Maybe tell us a little bit about that. And did you get any pushback? Did you get any hostility for what you wrote there?
That was a really interesting piece to tackle because my editor asked me if I wanted to write about this, and I had been seeing, as I'm sure like a lot of people had been seeing, the all of the media coverage that this Harvard professor was getting in his search for alien life. And I felt like what was really missing from that media coverage was a really in-depth dive into how the scientific community that he's a part of is responding to his claims or is evaluating his claims, right? And so I said, like, if I'm going to write this, let me fill that gap, And so I guess in a sense that if we are in agreement that objectivity is something to strive for but can never be achieved, like that is my scientific instinct coming into play, right? So in a case where it's used for the benefit, where it's like, okay, well, I can shed new light on this conversation that hasn't been shared before. And so I did. There was a lot of pushback. There were some people who were unhappy with the title, like the headline. A lot of people don't know that many journalists don't write their own headlines.
Right.
They thought it was misleading or made it seem like, the scientific community was just trying to hide the truth, the real truth. And then there were some people from the other side who thought that I gave him too much credence, that I gave, like I was giving him too much space. I think that there's a balance to walk, especially working at a platform like the New York Times, where there are so many people reading your work that even if you are not intentionally trying to support someone's views, you are putting them up on a platform just by covering them. And so that's a way that bias, I think, can creep into your reporting. And I think every journalist has a different way of dealing with that. Some people just ignore it entirely and allow that bias to be there or don't see it as a bias. Some people try to equalize the playing field by sort of like what I was doing was trying to give a voice to the people who didn't really have much voice in the media.
So it's like, even if the story itself is an objective recounting of certain research, it's like the fact that we chose to talk about that research and not something else, or the fact that we're giving more attention to something, like those are kind of what you're implying, like are these biases that creep in. And then I wanted to ask, why is it that the original Avi Loeb reporting was so like biased in this way? Like, why were we giving him so much credibility to talk about stuff that didn't really have so much of a scientific backing? Was it just that people didn't really understand the context, or was there something else going on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. I think one, because journalism loves a really good story, right? And someone saying that they found evidence of aliens is a really exciting story. It's a really engaging story. People want to hear it. A Harvard professor saying that, there's a lot of institutional backing behind that. Like, this isn't just some person from a university that no one has ever heard of, right? Like, this is Harvard. This is the university in the United States that everyone has heard of. So I think the media latched onto that. The other reason, or his claims were not being evaluated in the media so much until my article, is because a lot of the critiques were difficult to parse for the general public, right? Like, how do you explain to the general public concisely that someone doesn't have any uncertainties on their data and why that matters, right?
Right, like that's a technical thing of the statistics are missing.
Exactly. You have to break down what uncertainties are. Right, exactly. And if you have 600 words to tell a story, which a lot of outlets, are very constrained by word count, how do you get into that level of detail while still making it publicly accessible? And so the reason why my story ended up being almost 2,000 words is because, you just need space to kind of evaluate these scientific claims and just even understand the techniques around them so that you can make an informed decision, so that the public can make an informed decision on those claims. Right. And the really interesting response to that article for me was that several people who already believed Avi Loeb's claims, for them, it was just sort of like added confirmation. Like, it did nothing for anyone. It was just sort of an added confirmation. And then for people who were already skeptical, it was like, again, like added confirmation. So it was very interesting.
How could that be if you were kind of breaking down all the uncertainties behind what he was saying? How could it still have people like be more assertive in their beliefs?
I wish I could tell you. I think confirmation bias, maybe a little bit. People are going to hear and understand what they want to. They're going to look for things that support their hypothesis. My job was to sort of give readers the tools to evaluate these claims, not to evaluate them for them.
Yeah, and I think it also draws some light on the thing that you mentioned before, which I think is really interesting, which is, even if you're criticizing someone, if you're writing an article about them, you're still actually sharing their views to your audience. So you are kind of amplifying them, and the subtleties of that are really interesting and difficult.
Right. And so I think I did get some criticism that I should not have covered him. And I understand scientists who feel that way, but I think also that this was a subject that was already being covered. And if we're going to be talking about it anyway, then, the critiques also deserve to be discussed as well.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I agree with that totally, especially in this case where he was getting so much oxygen without the New York Times jumping in. I think having that kind of a referee in the fight was pretty helpful. So I want to back up a bit and ask a little bit about like how you got to where you are now. So to a lot of people in physics departments out there, for better or worse, and I'm not endorsing this, but the reality is that there's sort of an unwritten rule that you go to grad school in physics with the goal of becoming a physics researcher, a physics professor or something. That's not what you did. Did you know when you started that program that that's not what you wanted to do? Did you change your mind midway through? What was your plan? How did that play out?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I took my first physics class when I was a sophomore in college. So I was very late to the physics game.
Me too, by the way.
And so I didn't really have a good understanding of what you do with a physics degree. What does it mean to be an academic? What does it mean to be a professor? So that was all introduced to me in college. And it seemed as viable and as desirable a career option as any. I could be a professor. I could go on to do something else. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So it sounds kind of funny to say this, but grad school in a way was the path of least resistance because a lot of physics majors just go to graduate school. It's fully funded. You have some time to figure out your life, right? So even when I was in my early years of graduate school, I was still open to the idea of becoming an academic or becoming a research scientist somewhere. And I think the pacing of graduate school never really gave me a chance to sit down and think and career plan. And it wasn't until the pandemic hit that I actually had a chance to sit down. Those 2 or 3 dead months in the first few weeks of 2020 after the shutdown, I started thinking this is the path that I'm on. It's just a path that I've just passively been on because it's all I do. Is this going to be enough for me? Is this what I want to do? And I think during 2020, with the COVID-19 pandemic, and then also with a lot of the protests that were happening over the summer, I started to feel very like academia was a little too insulated for me. I spent all my time on my laptop coding, and it was very difficult for me to remember the bigger picture of why this mattered. And so I started looking for something that would make me feel like I was making more of an impact outside of the ivory tower. And so, I had heard about this program called the Mass Media Fellowship run by the AAAS. I had heard about it for years, and I'd always kept it in the back of my mind as something that that sounds very interesting that I might like to try to do. So the Mass Media Fellowship is a program that places scientists and engineers into newsrooms for the summer. And the goal is to strengthen the relationship between science and the media. And I always knew that I loved to write, right? So even before I was a physicist, I was a lifelong writer. And so it just seemed like a perfect merger of two things that I was very interested in. I applied, I got placed at Wired. So I spent the entire summer working as a journalist. I was completely in over my head, never worked as a journalist before. But I had a really great editor and mentor. And by the end of the summer, I was like, yes, this is exactly what I want to do. I love that it's public facing. I love that I still get to dip my toe into scientific community and scientific results. I don't feel like I need to be on the front lines of research to feel like I'm making an impact. And I get to share science with the community of people who raised me, my friends, my family, all of the people who I had felt so isolated from while being in academia, who are not academics and who couldn't really understand the importance of what I was working on.
So can I ask you about this one particular piece you wrote when you were at Wired? This piece actually made quite an impact for me. I remember when this came out, and it wasn't just me, but lots of people around my department saw this. This was like the water cooler discussion. Well, realistically, it was the coffee machine discussion. That's what we drink as physicists. And it hit a lot of people hard in a lot of different ways. Some people felt kind of hurt by it. Other people felt introspective. Other people felt confused. But we all felt something. And the article I'm talking about is called The Unwritten Laws of Physics for Black Women. Can you tell us a little bit about that and, what motivated you to write it and how you went about doing it and how it grew into the thing it became?
Absolutely. So that was a piece that I pitched to Wired at the end of my summer. And it took me about a year to write and report and edit. It was a very grueling process in itself. But the conception of that piece actually happened years earlier. So I think maybe my second or third year of graduate school, and this is also detailed in the essay. I just started to wonder, where are all the Black women? How many Black women have been here? I was dealing with a lot of interactions at the intersection of racism and sexism, microaggressive statements, just things that I really was not equipped for, and that there was no one who I felt like could teach me or help me navigate this, right? And so I started looking for people who had gone through the same path, like who had blazed this trail before me. And, I think that there was a need that I felt like could only be filled by understanding the lives and the careers of the Black women who had walked before me. And so by the time I pitched the piece, I had found these women, I had spoken to them, I had developed relationships with them. And originally I had wanted to do something to sort of just shed light on their histories, because I thought it was because the University of Chicago physics department was not able to even tell me the names of these women. I felt like they deserved better recognition. And so I had imagined like pitching a story to U Chicago Alumni Magazine, where I was just like biographies or profiles of the women who came before me, just so people would be familiar with their names, And I had mentioned it offhand to a features editor at Wired, and she was like, you should pitch that to me. And I was like, okay, well, why not? So it took a few rounds, and I originally wasn't planning to write myself into the story at all, but I think that she saw something that I didn't, in what impact it could have. And so it ended up being a blend of, or sort of a mirroring of like my experiences with the the Black women who had come before me. And it wasn't supposed to be an expose, it wasn't supposed to call anybody out, but it was a chance for, I think, the physics community as a whole to reflect on the very subtle ways that you make people feel like they don't belong, and how that can really, what feels like a very micro interaction to somebody, can really have an impact on somebody's entire career trajectory. Like the culmination of all of these small interactions, relatively small interactions, led me to switch research groups and start my PhD thesis all over after my second year of graduate school. So those first 2 years, everything that I had done, I gave up because I was looking for a healthier work environment where I felt like I could thrive. And so, I focused a lot on the University of Chicago because obviously that was my experience. That was very much my lived experience. But I think that when you broaden it out, it's not difficult to see these trends and these themes and these patterns at other universities as well.
So talking about some of your own writing again, and I'm going to focus here on some of the stuff I've seen in the Times. I was really impressed by the article you wrote about the nanograv result back in June.
Oh, thank you.
So gravitational waves can be produced by a lot of things in nature, but in this case, they're probably, not for sure, but probably being made by really big black holes merging. And that would create like just kind of a background of gravitational waves from all directions. And this particular collaboration is trying to detect those using radio observations of a network of pulsars around the whole Milky Way. So you kind of use the whole network of these pulsars throughout our whole galaxy as a big gravitational wave detector, which is pretty wild. But yeah, I mean, the thing that impressed me about this is that it's a hard thing to explain, like to understand what this experiment is, what they're trying to measure, how it works, and what they think they've seen. You need to like peel back like many layers of that complex multidimensional onion. How do you approach writing an article that's that complex in so few words?
Right. So one of the first things you learn as a journalist is that the way that you format an article is exactly opposite of the way that you would format like a scientific paper, right? So with a scientific publication, you start with your big picture introduction. what the field already knows. And then you go into, this is the experiment I set up, and this is the analysis I did, and then these are the results. And then with the journalistic article, you flip that. They call that the inverted triangle. So you start with the results. You start with what they actually did. And you do your best to summarize that in a way that's accessible to the general public without them knowing all of the context behind it, right? And then you get into like the methods that they did to do these things, and, what comes next and why this adds to the field and things like that. And so I do my best to sort of stay within that inverted triangle. They call it inverted triangle pattern. But I find that with a lot of physics and astronomy topics, physics more so than astronomy, it's difficult to do that because there's so much background knowledge that's needed. So a lot of times it's just a matter of talking it through to someone who is not a scientist or who doesn't have any, knowledge of this thing that I'm trying to describe, whether that's my partner or my editor or just a friend. And it's like, okay, how do I hook somebody? Like, what is the big exciting thing here? And in the case of nanograv, it's like reverberations through the universe, right? And even though people may not exactly understand what that means, like, it sounds really exciting and it makes the reader want to keep reading. And so you sort of start with this very general metaphor. I started with this very general metaphor in an attempt to describe the result. And then people who are interested can continue reading and sort of get into the nitty gritty and talk about like, well, what are these, reverberations? What are these gravitational waves actually? Where are they coming from? Why are they important? How are scientists studying them? But all that comes later. Like the big first chunk of the article is just, this is what scientists have figured out at the very bare bones level. There's also a distinction between what the general public will find interesting and what scientists find interesting. And as I get further and further away from being an active scientist, I find it easier to make that distinction. So for example, like, all of the scientists are going to care about what the sigma value is, what the uncertainties are. The general public doesn't know what that is off top. And it really has no place at the top of a story because no one's going to really understand unless you're in the field what that means. Can you,
at like a fairly top level statement, can you kind of turn statistical claims into common language claims? Like, scientists report what could be hints of this, or scientists report definitive evidence of this. Can you do that and keep people interested? Just not using the numbers?
Yes. One of the things for the nanograv piece in particular that I went back and forth with my editor was whether to call it a discovery or whether to call it evidence for, right? And if you paid attention to like the nanograv press releases and their conferences, they were always very careful to use the word evidence.
Yeah, never reached the 5 sigma statistical significance
discovery,
that we use for
exactly.
Discovery. Yeah.
And so that's something that, but in the general public's consciousness, those two things don't really have much distinction until you take a paragraph in a journalistic article to describe that, right? And so, I had an editor come in and change evidence to discovery. And I was like, no, we can't say this because X, Y, Z, and that is something that I think comes in very handy for me to have a scientific background.
Yeah, for sure.
Because I can sort of parse through, and words that maybe don't seem to have much significance to the general public may mean very different things to a scientist, right? And so sort of like straddling that line and making sure that it's accurate, but also engaging and accessible is what my job is. So
we've talked a bit on the show before about misinformation and, how sometimes there'll be, say, a press release or some article online and it seems legit and someone's talking about a real paper that came out and it has some like extravagant result and it's getting a lot of attention on Twitter or something like that. What advice do you have for people who are like just genuinely interested in science for like distinguishing and being able to parse, what is exaggerated, not very well done science journalism and what is the legit, like, what should I trust?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's difficult. It's a difficult one, right? Especially in the age of COVID. There's so much misinformation flying around. One thing to look for in scientific or articles written about scientific results is there an outside expert talking about these claims, evaluating these claims? Someone who was not involved in the study or the experiment, lending their opinion on how well this analysis was conducted, whether they're in agreement or not, right? So something I've always been taught is to try to balance articles with outside opinions, and that can go either way, right? The person on the outside can say, hey, this is a great example. This was very well done. This analysis was very robust. I actually think, Dan, that I used you for the G-2 result as an outside opinion. Or the person can say, this sucks. Like, this is terrible. And here's why. And here's what I'd like to see. Right. And so that's one indicator, I think, of an article that you can trust, is that it has a balance of voices.
So like people would see quotes from other people in the article.
Right.
Yeah.
People who are not involved in the study at all. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's probably the thing that I always look for. A balanced article should always have that. Another thing to just look for is, we are in a day and age where there are so many scientists who are breaking down the barrier between academia and the general public. Like, there are so many scientists on Twitter, or X, formerly known as Twitter, I'm required to say. YouTube, TikTok, like there's so many ways that you could get information directly from the source, right? That you can get information from trusted experts. More
generally speaking, like, how do you think overall, big picture, the field of science journalism is doing, like, these days? Like, what could they be doing better than they currently are as well?
I think science journalism is doing all right. I think it's in a good place. I think there's always more that could be done. Something that I would really like to see more of, and something that I've been trying to pivot into as I, get further into my reporting fellowship, is a more of a focus on the intersection of science and society. Mm-hmm. So, I obviously write a lot of stories about new studies that have come out, new planets that have been discovered, things that are just very far removed from the humans that populate this earth, right? But I've been trying to do a lot more showcasing that science is very much a human endeavor too, right? So in the sense of, all the good, the bad, and the ugly. To paint it as an example, the muon G-2 story that I did, that was a very difficult one. I always find it very hard to write about particle physics because it requires so much background before you can even explain to someone what a muon is, right? Like, you can say, like, oh, they're a particle, but what does that mean? What does a particle mean to someone who's not a particle physicist, right? And so what I did, to lead that story is to start with something that everyone could understand. And I just focused on this number. Like, scientists are trying to measure this number very precisely. And I built this whole scene around, like, a group of scientists going to there was some university in Europe that is failing me because it was so long ago, and they're all sitting in this room in anticipation for this number to be revealed. Mm-hmm. And then there were all these gasps when it didn't look like it was supposed to. And then there was another calculational step. And then there was all these sighs of relief, cheers, applause, And so even if the general public cannot understand what exactly this number means yet, they can share in the very human emotion that scientists have, like, while doing this work, right? So I really want to do more stories like that, like showcasing the human side of science, how science is affecting society, how scientists are also dealing with, a lot of things about being human within the pursuit of scientific truth itself.
So other than stuff that your colleagues at the New York Times is writing, where do you go to read really good science journalism? Are there any particular science journalists you might want to give a shout out to that you like and think we should all be looking towards?
Oh, wow. So one of my favorite science journalists, actually, who is not even in astronomy or physics, His name is Matt Simon, and he's a climate environment journalist at Wired. And he is someone who, echoing back to what we were discussing before, like, he's a writer. He's a really good writer. And he is one of those people who, like, I don't even need to see the byline to recognize it as a Matt Simon piece, because his voice is just so strong. It's so engaging. And so I always look forward to his articles. Let me also shout out my writing mentor, Nicholas St. Fleur. He does a podcast called Color Code that I also listen to. I listen to a lot because first of all, it's very enjoyable. It's about or maybe enjoyable is the wrong word. It's very informative. It's about the intersection of racism in healthcare. And the other reason I listen to, beyond the fact that I just enjoy the podcast, is that it's a very unique look into how a reporter interviews a source, because it's all in audio, right? And so it's a lesson for me. It's like, oh, this is how you are getting this information from a source. This is how you're building trust with a source. This is how you're formulating the question and getting all of this really good, what journalists call color, out of the story, right? As for publications, I read a lot of our competitors because I need to see what's going on. But I would say that in my spare time, most of the time I'm reading books. I really enjoy reading books. Right. So I started recently reading this book called, I think it's just called The Milky Way. It's by Moya McTeer. Yeah. She's a brilliant writer. It again has a very distinct voice, very interesting one. I read Chanda Prescott Weinstein's Disordered Cosmos, which is also, I found to be very interesting. I also like to just keep up with smaller publications. So like, to see, I guess they're not my peers anymore since I've graduated, but when I was a graduate student, I really enjoyed reading the Xylem, which does stories about science, graduate students about science. I've published on there before. And then like the Astro Bites, Particle Bites, all of those, just to keep up with, things that are going on in the fields that I'm interested in.
Thank you so much for sharing that. You're in like a really niche role and it's really cool to hear about.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sometimes I still have to pinch myself, like, how did I get here? But it's been fun. So I've been enjoying it a lot.
Why This Universe is brought to you by the University of Chicago Podcast Network. It's edited and produced by me, Shalma Wegsman, and my co-host is Dan Hooper, a professor of astrophysics at the University of Chicago and Fermilab. If you like our show and you want to support us even more, you can find us on Patreon. There you can access ad-free episodes of the show, as well as exclusive Ask Us Anything episodes where you get to ask Dan and I direct questions about physics or anything else. So if you are curious about that, you can find it at patreon.com/whythisuniverse. Thank you so much for listening and for your support.